Hey everyone, how's it going? It's Russell here, and thousands of Canadians are about to benefit financially due to some restrictions that have been lifted by Canada's big bank regulator, OSFI, or the Office for the Superintendent of Financial Institutions. Now, these regulations that were put in place at the beginning of the pandemic locked up billions of dollars in bank profits, and now that these restrictions and regulations are being raised, well, that money can be used to compensate certain Canadians. Now, a lot of this money will admittedly be going to bank CEOs and top executives, something that a lot of politicians are fighting back against. But in this video, we're going to go over exactly what's happening. I'm going to let you know who's going to be the ones benefiting financially from this, and how if you're not part of that group, you can add yourself rather easily. But before we do, if you're someone who's ever benefited from my videos, I have a quick favor to ask. I've recently launched a new channel focused on digital assets and cryptocurrency. I believe that behind all the get-rich-quick speculation, there's a lot of cool tech being built, and I want to bring you information on that. So if that sounds like something that you'd be interested in, check out the first link in the description where you can check out my new channel that I've just started to go more in depth on that. All right, let's get into these details on what's going on with the Canadian banking industry. At the beginning of the pandemic, roughly $750 billion was used to support the Canadian financial system. Now, this was for things like mortgage deferrals as well as other liquidity supports, which essentially helped make sure that there weren't going to be any sector-wide problems that caused a larger financial meltdown. But to make sure that the big banks didn't take advantage of these massive programs, the big bank regulator, OSFI, or the Office for the Superintendent of Financial Institutions, said, hey, whoa, you can't use this money to give it to your CEOs as big bonuses, and you can't use this money to pay out investors that have invested in your banks. But even with these restrictions, some politicians said, hey, that's not quite enough, including Peter Julian, an NDP member of Parliament, who penned this letter to the former Minister of Finance, Bill Morneau. Now, inside of this letter, Peter Julian makes some claims here. He says that there have been $750 billion provided, including regulatory relief and other liquidity supports to the financial sector. And he notes that during the last financial crisis in 2008, governments provided substantial support, much like they have during COVID, to the big banks, but those banks reaped huge profits and didn't really offer all that much real support to Canadians. And he even goes on to say that the big banks are not doing anything to help Canadian citizens, and that unlike some credit unions, the banks have not reduced interest charges on credit cards. That stayed the same throughout the pandemic, and they have not waived interest, penalties, and fees on loan deferrals. And even since this letter has been penned, some of these biggest banks have even raised transaction fees for everyday users of checking accounts and savings accounts. But, likely much to the disappointment of Peter Julian and other politicians who share his views, these restrictions are now being lifted off of the big banks, allowing them to start allocating the huge profits that they've made throughout the pandemic. Let me show you what I'm talking about. Just yesterday, the Globe and Mail put out this article announcing that these restrictions had been lifted, saying that Canada's banking regulator is immediately lifting these pandemic-related restrictions that prevented banks and insurers from raising dividends and buying back shares, but is urging bank executives to act responsibly as they deliver long-awaited payouts to investors. Now, these are two key things, dividends and share buybacks, that I'll explain to you very briefly here. Dividends are essentially like an interest rate that an investor receives just for holding a stock. So, say you have a stock that's worth $100 and you're earning 3% interest on that, each year you'd get paid out $3 on top of holding the stock. Now, share buybacks are a way to increase the value of a share, largely by the company who issued the shares originally, the stocks. They buy back a whole bunch of these stocks, essentially reducing the supply of these stocks on the market, meaning that there's an imbalance between supply and demand. If we have less supply and the same amount of demand, well, the value of things tends to go up in that sort of situation. And remember, very soon we're going to be getting into how you can set yourself up to benefit from this whole situation, but we have to get through a couple other things first. In this paragraph, the leader of the organization that regulates all of these big banks essentially says, hey, even though we are lifting these restrictions, we're hoping that big banks will be responsible and not raise these rates for investors too dramatically. But when we scroll down here to this final paragraph, we compare it to things that have happened in the US that didn't have similar restrictions, where we've seen the dividend hikes or the interest rate hikes go up of roughly 11%. This is the sort of interest that's paid out to investors, something that's quite a large interest increase. So all of this is to say that the people who are going to be most rewarded financially for this situation are the people who have invested in the big banks. Now, no matter what your political stance on this situation is, or on capitalism in general, I'm a firm believer that we need to learn and take advantage of the system that's already here right now. If we don't, it'll just be people who are already very, very wealthy taking advantage of the system that many people who are not as wealthy don't know how to work within. In this sort of system, I believe the wealth gap will continue to grow and more power will go into the hands of the very, very rich few. Now, on the other hand, if we're able to learn and educate the population on how to take advantage of this system, perhaps we can make more positive changes in the future. So if you're currently not someone who's set up to gain financially from these changes that are happening within the big banks, don't worry, it's actually super easy to add yourself to that list of people who's going to benefit, and I'll show you here in just a few steps. Now, of course, this isn't financial advice and you should do your own research on this sort of stuff, and I teach a lot more about this in more detail in the Canada Money Mastery course, but the number one thing that you should do to set yourself up is to open up a TFSA self-directed investment account. And the best places to do that are right now in Canada, in my opinion, Wealthsimple or Questrade. If you don't already have TFSA investment accounts set up at one of those two institutions, there are links in the description where you can do so. The reason I emphasize opening up a TFSA investment account is that in a TFSA account, any growth of your investment, any growth of the value of that stock, when you go to sell the stock, typically you're taxed on the growth, right? The government wants to take its cut of your investment, but if it's inside of a TFSA, you're not going to be taxed on that growth. You get to keep all of the profit. Inside of this TFSA, you're able to store shares or stocks of these big bank companies, and as a result, if you own a portion of these big banks, you're able to take advantage of these two ways that they're going to be giving money to Canadians, essentially dividend increases and share buybacks. Now, I'll show you how to do this in Wealthsimple, but the process is pretty similar no matter what platform you're on. Once you have your TFSA account open, inside of that account, you can start purchasing shares once you've funded it with a little bit of money. Now, in the case of these big banks, we'll take a look right here. Let's go with a Bank of Nova Scotia. You can take a look at this individual stock and you can find out what its current dividends are. So right now, when we scroll down here, if you notice this yield section, 4.34%, that's essentially like the interest rate that you're getting just for holding this stock. Now, if you have a whole bunch of money in your savings right now, you're probably not getting anywhere close to 4% returns on that on the savings that are sitting in your account. So if you were to purchase some Bank of Nova Scotia or Scotiabank stocks, you get paid 4.34%, and this is the dividend rate that we're expecting to go up dramatically here now that we've had these changes in regulation. And this interest rate that you're making on your money when you hold dividend stocks is paid out to you usually quarterly. And you can sort of see that in your account activity. Because I hold some of these stocks for these big Canadian banks, we see TD here, we see CIBC and Scotiabank. You can see these dividends that were paid out. Now, they're not huge amounts of money, $13, $14, $16, but this can start to add up, and it certainly is quite a lot better than holding your savings right now in a savings account. Now, if we look at the page here for the BMO stock, you'll notice that the share price is currently $138, which can be a lot of money. So if you're someone who's just getting started investing and wants to experiment with this, there's actually a cool feature on Wealthsimple called Fractional. You can click right there and it says fractional trading available. This means that you can purchase any amount of the stock. You don't have to actually purchase the whole thing for $138. You can trickle in maybe 25% of that, maybe 50%. So this makes it a lot easier for people who are just getting started to own a larger amount of investments. Now, on top of that dividend increase that most of these stocks are likely going to see, again, no one has a crystal ball on exactly what's going to happen, but likely these banks are going to do the share buybacks that I was talking about before, decreasing the supply of shares available on the market, and as a result, sort of making that imbalance between supply and demand, meaning it may be reasonable to think that the share price itself may also go up in the future, and as a result, the interest that you're earning is on a larger amount of money, meaning your dividends will go up as well. Now, even if you're not the biggest fan of these big banks and the way that they do business, I think it's still super important to learn how you can financially improve your life, and as a result, sort of spread this information so that more people can understand the rules that are played by in this game of money that oftentimes only the wealthiest know how to actually navigate. But But I want to know what you think about all of this. Do you think that it's entirely unethical to invest in big banks at all? Or do you already invest in some of these big banks and are looking forward to some of these dividend increases and share buybacks? Let me know down in the comments. I read every single one. And as a reminder, that first link in the description is to the crypto and digital assets channel I've started. I do talk about that a little bit here on the channel, but in this separate channel, we're going to go way more in depth into content that may not be appealing to the broader audience that I have on this main channel. I really appreciate your support in going over there and subscribing to that channel as I start making videos about something I'm really passionate about as of late. But with all of that said, thanks so much for watching, everybody. I really hope this video has helped you out at least a little bit, and I'll see you next time.